The Africa Roundtable, a podcast by the Global Perspectives Initiative.
Many African countries are still struggling to recover from the damage caused by European colonization. In many regions, land tenure is still irregular and geared towards wealthy and often white minorities. Thus, the violence of colonization is still very present in Africa. The perspective on the type of responsibility that arises as a result of that time often sounds different in African cities than in Paris, Brussels, Lisbon, or Berlin. It is with one of these African voices that we want to speak today. Nanjala Nyabola is one of the most famous voices in Africa. She is an author, political scientist, and activist based in Nairobi. Nyabola writes extensively on African society and politics, as well as technology, international law, and feminism for a wide audience. Welcome to the Africa Roundtable, the podcast by GBI. The following interview will be conducted by Christine Mondra.
Welcome, everybody, to this podcast episode. And I am sitting with the Kenyan author, Nanjala Nyabola. She is, of course, needs no introduction to many of us, but she is a Kenyan author who studied political science, African studies, and migration in Birmingham and Oxford, and publishes academically and non-academically on literature, society, international law, feminism, media, and digitalization in Africa. Nanjala has also worked as a journalist for the BBC, for Al Jazeera, The Guardian, and OK Africa, among others. She's a member of the board of directors of Amnesty International in Kenya and is invited regularly to speak on digital policy at numerous international conferences, including Republica, the Forum on the Internet Freedom, and RightsCon, among other things. Nanjala, it's always great to be in conversation with you. I like to think of you as one of our sort of like, in terms of the younger generations of thought leaders on the continent. I think your voice is really important. As a woman on the continent, we really value some of your messaging. But we're talking today about post-colonialism. And if we could just start off by just, letting everybody in on when we're talking about post-colonialism, before we get into what the structures are and how they impact the policy, let's just talk about what do we mean when we're having this conversation about post-colonialism? What exactly are we actually talking about?
First of all, thank you for having me. It's good to be here. I think that post-colonialism is a very interesting concept because there is very good or substantial there's a substantive argument to be made that the post in post-colonialism hasn't quite happened yet. And the reason why the post hasn't happened yet is that African societies are still primarily structured around the idea of extraction. How can we take raw materials? How can we take labor? How can we take ideas from the continent and alienate them from the continent so that their maximum potential is realized elsewhere? And so I think very carefully about using the word post because I feel like there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. And in fairness, we are talking about 50 years of history, 60 years of history, 70 years of history. In a world, where we're talking about millennia, like in the global sense of the word. So it's work that needs to still be done. And it's work that it's a state status that still needs to be achieved. And it's something that we still need to keep working towards.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I think from what I'm hearing you saying, the reality is more neo-colonialism rather than post-colonialism, because we're not yet uhuru, if I can put it that way. Not yet uhuru. We're not yet uhuru. And it's interesting. I mean, the both of us, you coming from Kenya, me coming from Zimbabwe, we're both from former British colonies. Perhaps talk our audience through just how we are seeing this form of neo-colonialism, right?
So the settler colonies in Africa are obviously South Africa, Zimbabwe, Zambia, Kenya, Uganda, Algeria, Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, right? These are countries where you see not just the economic interest, but also a cultural interest, that there's actually a great amount of energy that's put towards dismembering African social structures. Namibia, breaking things apart and remaking the African person, not just the African land and territory, but remaking the African person in the image of Europe. And that has very significant consequences. These are places where, for example, European languages take precedence over African languages. I don't know if you hear this sometimes in Zimbabwe, but you'll hear it in Kenya. Sometimes you'll ask someone how many languages you speak, and they'll say one, because English is a language, but Kikuyu and Luya and Banyala and whatever, those are not languages. In the imagination of the what Frantz Fanon would call the consciousness is broken in a very specific way. And so settler colonies, the cultural imprint is just as important to the colonial project as the economic footprint. Whereas you have countries like the Central African Republic, like Chad, like Sudan, whereby the interest was really almost purely economical and political. There is no effort to break apart the social structures, or muted effort to break apart the social structures. And a greater emphasis was put on how can we get as much money, resources out of these countries as we possibly can. In the modern era, this plays out in, first of all, the kind of affiliations that exist, right? When settler communities don't leave, there remains a strong political connection with the parent country. And that connection manifests itself in interference in political action. The debate around conservation in Kenya is rooted in this idea that it's more important to alienate land for, and I love wild animals. Like if you catch me on a weekend, I'm in a national park. I love the principle of conservation, but the way that it's being done in this legacy of settler colonization in Kenya is that land is being alienated on an enormous scale. And we as citizens of the country are not even invited to participate in the fruits of this conservation, right? These private conservancies are places where European travelers can fly in without having even to go through customs at the regular airport. And we as Kenyans cannot participate in these efforts at conservation. But at the root of some of these political phenomena that we try to explain in contemporary terms without reference to the past, is an alienation question, a colonial question that has been poorly addressed because we had an elite compact take place over true restitution, over true restoration. And we have a class of elites in many of our countries that have benefited from these structures, and their economic interests have become more important than the general well-being. And this is the tension that I think a lot of us are living with, because we don't want to go back to the past, don't want to go back to colonization, but we recognize that the elite compact is also insufficient to the freedom that we were fighting for.
I can tell you, having lived in South Africa, which neighbors Zimbabwe as well, you can hear the conversation, younger people getting involved in the conversation about land. You talked about land. There is this consciousness that, without the land, we don't have any.
It's like one or two steps, and you go back to this elite compact of why is it that these farmers can't get agricultural land? And I think in many countries right now, and many countries in Africa right now, there is a generational shift. More and more young people are asking critical questions of the movements that led them to independence. And I think it's healthy. I think it's part of getting us closer to that post that we're looking for, that we are no longer blindly accepting narratives that we have inherited from previous generations, but we are asking tough questions about what we want our societies to look like. Who do we want African countries and social structures to serve?
Nanjala, you put Namibia on the list of settler colonies. And I wanted us to talk about Namibia, for example, because that relates directly to Germany.
It's interesting that when African countries talk about reparations for the colonial violence, there's always this awkward silence from European countries. And I think the Namibians have, in Namibia and Kenya, actually, in both countries, we've had court cases that have been won that have said you actually have to do restitution for this damage. Because when bad things happen in Africa, we're always told that it's ancient history. But of course, the Herero genocide is not ancient history. Survivors are present to, share accounts of this is what happened to my mother. This is what happened to my family. When we think about the independence movement in Kenya, which was also characterized by genocidal intent on the part of the British government, and the atrocities are very well documented. People who went into internment camps set up by the British government in Kenya are still alive, right? It's not ancient history. And so purely in terms of time, if you can do reparations for the atrocities that Germany committed during the Second World War, there is no logical reason why we can't have the same conversation about what's happening in Africa. There is no logical reason. And the thing is, it's one of the interesting contours that, again, for me, makes me pause on embracing post as a label completely. Because where is the post when there is no justice, when we are barely getting an acknowledgement that these violences happened, even though the social consequences are everywhere? The generational trauma of taking almost, I think it was about 1/3 of the Kikuyu population in Kenya, putting them in internment camps, of the Herero massacre, that generational trauma is still present, and it's compounded by the silences. So it's good that we're finally getting a conversation around it. But I think it's important to sit with the discomfort of the reparations conversation, that an apology is well and good enough, but what are you then going to do about it? Because the profits, the proceeds of the settler colony process are still being enjoyed in Europe, right? People are still benefiting from the economic benefits that were created by the process of colonization.
So, I imagine that we've got some, policymakers in the German government listening to us today, and they're thinking, well, we've just done this thing, right? The German government, we're working on this deal with the government in Namibia to pay a sum of money that's going to go towards development policy. We've identified this as an effective means of making an attempt to right our wrongs, right? How far does that go in the context of, getting us towards actual post-colonialism?
Is it possible to use development policy to provide reparations when the logic of development is still also rooted in colonial inequalities? That's where I get stuck. Because development as a discipline, as a practice, still is contoured around asymmetries of power, asymmetries of access, asymmetries of, capacity. We have to create, the rhetoric of development itself needs to be decolonized. The rhetoric of, putting reparations, funneling reparations, cash or money or resources through the development framework, I just don't think it's sufficient. I really don't, because development itself needs to be decolonized. It has become an extension of the political ambitions of a handful of countries, a projection of power that isn't premised on partnership, but is premised on maintaining these power disparities. And I'm not sure that it will achieve the justice goals that we really need to be achieved through the rhetoric or through the practice of reparations. I recognize that there's a lot of interest, and there are people who are trying to do the right thing, right? Who work in these spaces. But the truth is, with the development rhetoric and the discourse, we're not there yet. And when you see just to put it briefly, I really just don't think that the discourse on development is going to provide the justice that is required to achieve the reparations goal. I think it should be a separate stream of funding, if you will. I think it should go directly to Namibian people with as little bureaucratic interference as possible. What is this idea that if you just give money to people, they won't know what to do with it? Whether they spend it on alcohol or whether they spend it on drilling water, that's the prerogative of freedom. It's like when you give money to poor people, that's the prerogative of freedom. That's what it means to be free. It's your choice. You decide.
Yeah, I mean, that was actually, we've pivoted into that question as well, just about how Germany can tackle its sort of post-colonial structure when it comes to development policy.
I think that it involves the humility of asking what the people want. I think too much development policy is predetermined in Berlin, in DC, in London, and you have the internal meetings and you have the conversation and you decide what your priorities are, and then you go off and do the priorities independently of what the people who will be on the other side of that want or think that they want. In other countries, there can't be a one-size-fits-all approach to doing partnerships in the second largest continent in the world. There can't be a one-size-fits-all approach to thinking about reparations, restitution, restoration in, for 1 billion people. You could fit all of Western Europe into Africa like 7 times over. Nobody would ever propose a partnership, right? That's why we have a German Africa Summit, and we have a France Africa Summit, and we have a UK Africa Summit, and we have a whatever Africa Summit, because there's no suggestion that there can be one. Even with the EU, there is no suggestion that there can be one way of engaging with Europe. So why are we so married to the idea that there has to be one way of engaging with Africa? The other thing, as I said, is I think that looking for ways of working directly with people who are already doing the work and supporting those people can be a valuable asset towards realizing the goals of restitution. And I think that reconfiguring the goal of development from munificence, we from our high tower come down and bestow goodness upon you, and reframing it to be a conversation about partnership, I think starts you off with a different set of questions, right? Because as a partner, your goal is not to be a custodian. Your goal is to support. Your goal is to engage. Your goal is to collaborate.
I mean, and as we're coming to the close of this conversation, do you get the sense that there is a real opportunity here, right? We have a new movement in Berlin. It's a new coalition, the Social Democrats, the
Greens,
and the Free Democrats, the FDP. I mean, is there an opportunity to do things differently?
Absolutely.
For Germany to break away from the mold?
I think one area where Germany has tremendous capacity to make a difference is green energy. And that's why me personally, I'm excited to see the Greens have a little bit more power. Because right now, everybody's leaning towards coal as a short-term solution for the energy crisis or the perceived energy crisis. And the environmental harm that this coal will cause cannot be overstated. Germany has done a really interesting job about rethinking its power mix and thinking about, green energy and how can we fund green energy? How can we fund alternative ways of thinking about energy? I would love to see that be more of a conversation. I think that would be a really interesting thing to think about. What kind of partnerships are needed to make that, possible? There's a lot of conversation about tech and investments in tech. And I think that's really interesting and important. But look, the biggest leaps in tech uptake don't happen when external funders come in and, build labs and what do you call them? You know what I mean? There's, what do they call them? Hubs,
yeah.
Right? They happen when governments make investments in fiber optics. They happen, when governments look at internet as public infrastructure and make those investments. So all of this stuff with the hubs is interesting and attractive and whatever, but ultimately this is something that countries are going to have to take on themselves. Same way that they take on water, same way that they take on all other things. But in terms of green energy, in terms of reframing education, right now, social sciences and humanities departments in African universities are being decimated because everybody wants to do computer science, everybody wants to do business, everybody wants to do, engineering or whatever. And the reality is you need both. You need people who are doing sciences, you need people who are doing arts, you need people who are doing humanities. We can't all be computer scientists. We can't all be engineers. So seeing more strategic investments in the education sector, more strategic partnerships in the education sector, I think would be really, and in the cultural, I think we've seen an upswing in German investments in culture, but I think, there's still a little bit room to be done, for more to be done.
I think this would be it in terms of my questions. Do you maybe want to leave us off with a final thought? I mean, there's so many nuggets out of this conversation.
So many places to go. I think in the same way that German people have been bold in reimagining their political, their public space, in resisting the growth of the right wing, in resisting the anti-refugee, anti-immigrant rhetoric that's dominated the rest of Europe. Be bold in rethinking the way foreign policy could be shaped.
New perspectives, insights, and global analysis. Subscribe to the free newsletter by GPI, the Global Perspectives Initiative. globalperspectivesinitiative.org.
That was Nanjala Nyabola in conversation with Christine Mundwa. Now we want to look at the colonial period and the responsibility that has arisen as a result from a German perspective. We are doing this together with Professor Dr. Carola Lentz, who is the president of the Goethe Institute. Ms. Lentz, what role do the issue of colonialism and post-colonialism play in German cultural representation abroad and especially in African countries?
Das ist für uns ein sehr wichtiges Thema, weil wir in einer asymmetrischen...
This is a very important topic for us because we're still living in an asymmetrical world. Despite the end to colonialism, the asymmetrical relations with the former colonies have certainly not changed entirely. This is a topic that is, among other things, repeatedly brought up in our discussions in our work, particularly in our work with many cultural and intellectual partners, including those in African countries themselves. We did commence a large project in 2017, but unfortunately it had a long lead time in the countries where African intellectuals had been conducting research on how the German colonial era is dealt with artistically and with discursive formats from a modern perspective. This was then brought together with many artistic and intellectual interventions at a large conference in Yaoundé. It was a project where different African memory actors came together and exchanged their different experiences with the German colonial regime, as well as with the post-colonial period. In other words, the role of the Goethe Institute there was one of networking and listening. The German Goethe employees mainly let Africans report and express their attitudes towards this colonial history.
Im Wesentlichen sich vor allen Dingen von Afrikanern berichten und zeigen lassen, wie die über diese Kolonialgeschichte denken.
What has your experience been with that? How big is the interest on these topics in these countries?
Ich arbeite ja selbst seit über 40 Jahren inzwischen in Ghana und Burkina Faso und
I myself have been working in Ghana and Burkina Faso for over 40 years, and I'm also deeply involved in the topic of colonialism, particularly colonial history. I've done a lot of research on this topic area and have observed an interesting development. When I first became interested in this topic in the 1980s, there were still contemporary witnesses who had experienced colonialism themselves in the case of British and French colonialism and the everyday life of peasants. The interest in this topic was not that great and was only mentioned in passing. These were things that the local traditional authorities, who were then perceived as the oppressors, had put in place. But that has since changed in the cities, in intellectual circles, and even among the younger generation. The issue of colonialism has become quite important.
In den intellektuellen Kreisen unter der jüngeren Generation ist dieses Thema Kolonialismus durchaus wichtiger geworden.
And with that, we are slowly working our way towards a central focus. From your point of view, what does Germany's colonial responsibility look like in principle?
Also eine koloniale Verantwortung haben wir gar nicht, sondern wir haben eine Verantwortung, uns mit der kolonialen Vergangenheit auseinanderzusetzen.
We don't actually have a colonial responsibility at all, but we do have a responsibility to deal with colonial past. I hope that this responsibility moves us away from colonial relations with our former colonized societies. First of all, I believe that this is a pan-European project that we have to tackle with other memorial actors and other persons in Europe who are responsible. It is also interesting to see that the Goethe Institute is being active because it has brought together certain groups of post-colonial activists who are active in this work of remembrance in Europe and who have exchanged ideas because the dynamics in Belgium, for example, differ to those in France, Great Britain, Portugal, and Germany. I believe that this is an important chapter in our history that we must work through together, but above all with humility and listening. I think that's where it starts. There was a conference organized by the Federal Foreign Office roughly 18 months to 2 years ago called Shared History. The author, an African author, who gave the introductory lecture there, strongly criticized this title and then said to others that it is not yet a divided story. This story must first be recognized as one that Africans experienced differently to Europeans. The pain and the suffering is something that is primarily up to the Africans to express, and it is the Europeans that should listen. I think it's only when we recognize that it's not a simple and divided story, but really an intertwined and conflicted story, then we can look to the future, so we can develop more open, shared relationships that are also progressing towards a common future. As far as we are concerned, our way of working for about 10 to 15 years has really been one of very close cooperation with local partner organizations. This means that it is often not the delegates from the Goethe Institute, the German employees, who design the content of the programs, but rather they provide space and enable meetings, artistic work on now, in the case of Africa, African actors. I experienced this on my last visit to Senegal, where an extremely exciting project is taking place by helping the local music scene to develop something similar to charts, which allows for higher visibility of audibility and exposure of certain great local musicians, and by music journalists from different radio stations educating themselves and jointly developing a way through an instrument, so that you can create something like a hit list. This doesn't exist in Senegal yet, but would serve as a way to better get to know certain things about Senegal, and then perhaps the hits would also be visible outside of Senegal. This is a typical project that Goethe does in cooperation with local partners, whereby the role of the Goethe Institute is to provide experts who can accompany the Senegalese actors on this path. Museum for Africa is such an important project which involves peer-to-peer learning. Various African museums, such as Senegal, Uganda, Nigeria, and South Africa, have mutual exchange and consultation programs where they visit each other in a kind of peer-to-peer learning and learn from each other. What are the challenges and how might you design them? The Goethe Institute also offers expertise in areas that might be required. For example, we provide advanced training and arrange advanced training for restorers of objects. But this doesn't interfere with the formation of conceptual questions from the outset, so to speak. What might an African museum of the future look like? I think that's very important to consider. We're networkers and enablers, and that is the specifically German approach. This also distinguishes us from the Institut Français, which is integrated into the messages and conveys a kind of cultural export of French cultural actors to a much greater extent. The Goethe Institute is far more reserved on locations in Africa, and the same can actually be said about Asia and elsewhere. We take a very close look at our local scenes, think about how we can support them, and discuss what offers are needed to promote the scenes that are often not as well supported by states. It's not like here in Germany, where there is a municipal theater in every city. The cultural landscape is much more dependent on support from outside the state, and we really like working with local partners.
Das ist ja nicht so wie bei uns in Deutschland, wo es also in jeder Stadt ein Stadttheater gibt. Die Kulturlandschaft ist sehr viel stärker abhängig von Unterstützung, teilweise doch auch durchaus von außen. Und wir arbeiten eben da sehr gerne mit lokalen Partnern zusammen.
Ms. Lentz, finally, Germany has been conducting a so-called return debate for years. German museums contain thousands of artifacts from all over the world. Still, the restitution of the colonial artifacts is a bit of a drag. But what is the position of the Goethe Institute here?
Wir selbst haben keine Objekte, das ist ganz wichtig, sich in Erinnerung zu rufen. Wir haben diesen Prozess mit unseren Museumsdialogen.
We ourselves have no objects. It's very important to remember that. We have accompanied this process with our museum dialogues, and in some cases we have actually pushed it forward and are now in close contact with many museums in Germany. If we now look again at Africa, particularly African museums and the position of the Goethe Institute, it is very clear that it is important to restitute objects that were acquired in colonial contexts of injustice. A project that you can call successful is that of the Invisible International Inventories Program, where the Kenyan National Museum, together with Joost Rautenstrauch in Cologne and the Weltkulturen Museum in Frankfurt, are creating a digital inventory of all objects from Kenyan societies and cultural contexts located in the most diverse part in the world, outside of Kenya. And in this context, there were also 3 exhibitions. One was first in Kenya, then migrated to Cologne, and then to Frankfurt. Each time it was slightly different and had been adapted to fit the local audience. This is a good example of such an intervention in this debate, because partner networks have emerged between German museums and African museums. In this example, the Kenyan National Museum, which not only addressed the question of whether a single object is able to migrate from Germany or from Europe back to Kenya, but also raises the question, how has this context been reintroduced into a museum context? Which exhibition formats are available? Which objects should perhaps remain in Europe? How can you knit partnerships that escape the independent and paternalistic relationships of the past?
Sollen vielleicht auch in Europa verbleiben. Wie kann man Partnerschaften stricken, die also wegkommen von diesen abhängigen und paternalistischen Beziehungen der Vergangenheit?
That was Carola Lentz, president of the Goethe Institute, and that was today's edition of our podcast. Thanks for your interest, thanks for listening on behalf of the entire GPI team, says Daniel Höpfner.
The Africa Roundtable. This podcast is a production of the Global Perspectives Initiative.